Welcome to today's program in the Our Finger Lakes History series. February is Black History Month, so I have chosen to deal with the Underground Railroad in the Finger Lakes in the years before the Civil War as today's program. I am going to use the term Underground Railroad in its broadest meaning to refer to any form of anti-slavery activity, including but not limited to the actual loosely organized network of providing assistance to runaway slaves so that they could reach freedom in northern states or in Canada. Anti-slavery activity was called the Underground Railroad, but the term Underground Railroad can be a very misleading term. The Underground Railroad in many cases did not take place underground, and it frequently did not include a railroad. In this map, you see the routes that runaway slaves on southern plantations might take, but the routes went in different directions. More specifically, if you were escaping a plantation in a deep South state, you probably headed to Texas or to the islands in the Caribbean. From the more northern parts of the South, runaway slaves, or today we use the term freedom seekers, would head north. Today we use the term freedom seeker to refer to what were called fugitive slaves or runaway slaves in the years before the Civil War. To keep somewhat of a historical context for before the Civil War, in this program, I'm probably going to use the term runaway slave, as that what was the term used at that time. Here you see some typical examples of posters for runaway slaves. Freedom seekers were considered to be a valuable piece of property by their owner. As a result, it was common to offer significant rewards to those who would help to return a runaway slave to their master. Some people, commonly called slave catchers, tried to make a living by rounding up runaway slaves and returning them to their master and getting that reward. It has been written that Harriet Tubman, the famous conductress of the Underground Railroad, usually left with her passengers on a Saturday night deliberately because it would not be until Monday morning that a plantation owner could get to a print shop and have reward posters printed. Much of the detailed information that I'm going to be talking about in this program is the product of Dr. Judith Wellman, who has conducted in-depth research studies in several counties. Ours in New York State, in Seneca County, was done in 2005-2006. These county studies were funded by the Preservation League of New York State and the New York State Council on the Arts. These county studies are typically fully accessible on the internet. The Seneca County site study is on the internet. The Underground Railroad activity in upstate New York is a major aspect of the reforming zeal that came out of the Second Great Awakening. In the 1820s, 1830s, 1840s, a new version of Protestant belief swept over upstate New York. The key preacher of this new Protestant belief was the Reverend Charles Grandison Finney. Reverend Finney stressed that man can determine right from wrong and will strive, therefore, to do what is right. Upstate New York became known as the burned-over district because virtually all upstate residents were caught up in this renewed religious awakening, to the point that there was no one left to bring back to the faith, just like a forest fire that burns everything in its path. With this new Protestantism, there quickly arose a realization that if you see something wrong in society, you must work to correct it. One of the most obvious societal evils was slavery, at least in the eyes of many Northerners. As I have indicated, I will be using the term Underground Railroad in its broadest meaning, referring to any kind of anti-slavery activity. We can probably safely say that most freedom seekers who came to Seneca Falls, Waterloo, and Geneva area came up through Pennsylvania to Elmira. At Elmira, they were probably aided by John Jones and then proceeded north. The Fugitive Slave Act of 1850, made it illegal to give any kind of aid to a runaway slave. So Underground Railroad activities, in the narrow meaning of the term Underground Railroad, usually had to be done in secret. Although it was a secretive operation, historians in recent years have gleaned much information about Underground Railroad activity by studying census data, subscriptions to various anti-slavery publications, looking at the content information in probated wills, and so on. These documents help to give us some real insight into how extensive Underground Railroad activity was in the years preceding the Civil War. That many people were openly defying the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850, apparently believing that there was a higher moral law that must be followed instead. It is important to understand that all kinds of people were involved in anti-slavery activity. Obviously, some people of great wealth and high political position would be able to do more to advance the anti-slavery cause. But we should take pride in acknowledging the contributions of all classes of people who did what they could to promote the cause. Some groups, such as Quakers, had a high proportion of their members involved in anti-slavery activity. This was probably because Quakers or Friends believed in the innate equality of everyone, male and female, white and non-white. In the 1840s, some new churches arose out of the Second Great Awakening. These come-outer churches, as they were called, were anti-slavery. The most famous of these come-outer churches were the Wesleyan Methodist congregations. A very active Wesleyan Methodist congregation was established in Seneca Falls. Using the term Underground Railroad in its broadest meaning, there were many kinds of Underground Railroad activity. In this slide, you will note that there were many African Americans living in upstate New York counties before, during, and right after the Civil War. Typically, the numbers for these various counties of African Americans declined in 1860 compared to 1850. This is probably because of the tensions arising from the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850. Garrett Smith is a first cousin of Elizabeth Cady Stanton. Garrett Smith was a strong abolitionist. He was probably the wealthiest person and the largest landowner in New York State in his lifetime. As indicated in this information from a Syracuse Post-Standard article, in the year 1846 alone, Garrett Smith gave away more than 120,000 acres of land he owned. He gave it to freed slaves so that the male household head in that African American family could meet the then property qualifications to be able to vote. That property qualification for non-white males was typically 40 acres of property or an equivalent wealth. Not surprisingly, throughout upstate New York, we have numerous instances of these black households naming their next born son Garrett as a first name and Smith as a middle name. This was true, for example, of the Van Horn family in Ovid. Here we have an 1837 notice that a meeting was going to be held in the then Methodist Church building in Seneca Falls to organize the Seneca County Anti-Slavery Society. And the names that are signed as part of this meeting notice are some of the prominent names in Seneca Falls and Waterloo at the time. Here we have a notice of an anti-slavery fair that was being held in Seneca Falls. Although the notice didn't say it, without doubt the proceeds from the fair were to be used to pay the costs of freedom seekers using the train from Seneca Falls to proceed to freedom in Canada. In the summer of 1848, we have, of course, the famous Women's Rights Convention being held in Seneca Falls, but that summer there were a series of meetings of the Free Soil Party. The Free Soil Party was determined to not let any territories the United States gained from Mexico in that Mexican War become possible slave states of the Union. Many of the names that appeared in this newspaper notice were also names of prominent businessmen in Seneca Falls and Waterloo. Now, as I said, Dr. Judith Wellman did a number of studies in different counties of Underground Railroad activity, and she had to deal with the reality that there were lots of oral tradition stories that might be true or they might be at least misleading. So we have to deal with these oral tradition stories. So Dr. Wellman, in her research work, invented what has become known as the Wellman scale. If there is an oral tradition story that a certain house was a station on the Underground Railroad, she would give that property a level 2 rating on her scale. If evidence could be found in her research work or later to support that oral tradition story for that particular place, then it could be raised maybe to level 3 or 4. If we can find what I call smoking gun kind of evidence to remove any doubt about that place and that story being clearly true, then it could be raised to level 5. But if evidence can be found to disprove the validity of the oral tradition story about some place, then it would be lowered to level 1. Example, the Night House at 96 State Street in Seneca Falls. For years there was this oral tradition that it was an actual station on the Underground Railroad, largely because the house was near the train station in Seneca Falls, close enough to hide a person in a closet until the train arrived and then very quickly get the person onto that train. Our Seneca County Underground Railroad Study research assistant, however, found that this house was not even built until 1871, a few years after the end of the Civil War. Another way in which anti-slavery businessmen could help to do away with slavery was by deliberately building woolen mills as an alternative to cotton mills. Waterloo area businessmen such as Richard P. Hunt started a woolen mill in Waterloo in the mid-1830s. Seneca Falls businessmen such as Jacob Chamberlain opened a woolen mill in Seneca Falls in 1844. It should be added here that area farmers could not grow cotton but they could raise sheep. So by creating a new large local market for wool was a way in which many area farmers could be convinced to support anti-slavery measures. Ansel and Eliza Sherwood Bascom had this house built about 1828 in Seneca Falls, making it one of the oldest houses that still exist. Ansel Bascom was a major land developer in Seneca Falls, and he was involved in many reform causes, including abolition. His wife, Eliza Sherwood, is one of the Sherwoods in Skaneateles, where they carried on many Underground Railroad activities. The Bascoms had the fiery abolitionist Abby Kelly speak in their apple orchard south of this house in August of 1843, when no church in Seneca Falls would open its doors to her strong denunciation of any church or any person who did not take a strong anti-slavery position. This is the Wesleyan Church as it looks today. This church was started in 1843, but not completed until late 1843, and it's an example of what was happening in many upstate New York communities with come-outer churches that are taking a strong stand against slavery. Of course, this chapel is famous as being the site of the Women's Rights Convention in July 1848. Just north of the chapel is this house that served as the parsonage for the Wesleyan congregation for many years. Several pastors used this parsonage as a station on the Underground Railroad. For example, the Reverend Pegler was harboring a freedom seeker named Peter Bannister in November of 1844, and he got Peter to speak in the Wesleyan Chapel. It was quite an event. On Lower Lake Road in Seneca Falls, near Cayuga Lake State Park, is this cobblestone house that was built by the abolitionist Julius Bull. It was basically located at the western terminus of the ferry line that crossed Cayuga Lake and near the western terminus of the Cayuga Long Bridge that was used for many years to get across Cayuga Lake. The house is clearly believed to be a station on the Underground Railroad, harboring freedom seekers who were helped by Quakers in the Cayuga County community of Sherwood, then to Union Springs, then to cross Cayuga Lake to this house, where Julius Bull would then get them to the train station in Seneca Falls. Near the train station in Seneca Falls is this house of Thomas James. For many years in Seneca Falls preceding the Civil War, we had two freedom seekers who made their living as barbers in Seneca Falls. One of them is this Thomas James. He lived in this house. So we have to assume that because it's so near to the train station, that he would provide whatever assistance he could to help get other freedom seekers safely onto the train and out of Seneca Falls. The upper left picture shows his residence as it looks today. Thomas James actually became rather prosperous. He owned several parcels of property, and in the early 1860s, he built the three-story brick building shown at the lower right. It's at the corner of Cayuga and Fall Street, and today it houses the Chemung Canal Bank Trust building and also law offices on the top floor. His house has been placed on the National Park Service's Underground Railroad Network to Freedom. Here we see two newspaper articles about Thomas James building that new three-story building. In these newspaper articles, we have clear evidence that Thomas James himself was a fugitive slave. The other freedom-seeking barber in Seneca Falls was Joshua Wright. This is his house. He received a land grant from Gerrit Smith so that he would be able to meet the then property qualifications for non-white males to be able to vote in New York. You will note that he also subscribed to anti-slavery publications, and like Thomas James, was also a trustee in that local Wesleyan church. It is significant and important to understand that working and middle-class people could contribute significantly to anti-slavery efforts. They could sign anti-slavery petitions that were being sent to Congress. They could become involved in the Free Soil Party movement. They could be members of that Wesleyan Methodist congregation. The Rhoda Beeman incident in 1843 into 1844 has very definite Underground Railroad importance. She was a member of the Presbyterian Church in Seneca Falls, and the church building as it looked at that time is shown at the lower left. Beeman and Elizabeth McClintock organized an anti-slavery fair. I'd shown that notice before, but their names appeared with that notice. She gave that notice to be read by the pastor from the pulpit on Sunday mornings. But the pastor didn't read the notice on 2 consecutive Sundays, and Rhoda Beeman confronted him as to why he didn't read it. This led to a shouting match, which prompted the pastor to have the church session put Rhoda Beeman on trial for her unchristian conduct. She was found guilty, but she would not repent. When she started attending the Wesleyan Church, she was expelled as a member of the Presbyterian Church. In this incident, we see how Underground Railroad events were causing splits within local churches. Shown here are the 5 ladies that decided to call that first Women's Rights Convention. I want to point out that there was a major connection between anti-slavery movement and the festering women's rights movement. It is probably safe to say that there would not have been a women's rights movement had there not been an anti-slavery movement. And I say that for 2 reasons. One reason is the involvement of women in the anti-slavery movement raised their consciousness of how women had been treated inferior to men. The second reason, the involvement of women in the anti-slavery movement enabled these women to learn important leadership skills, how to plan and conduct a meeting, for example. There is also a strong Quaker connection to the Underground Railroad. Many Quakers were actively involved, and that is largely because the Society of Friends believed in the innate equality of all people, male and female, white and non-white. One prominent Quaker in Waterloo was Richard P. Hunt. This is his house as it looks today. He was probably the richest person in Waterloo and perhaps even all of Seneca County in his lifetime. This shows what his house looked like in the late 1850s. Also shown is a picture of Richard P. Hunt and his last wife, Jane Master Hunt. We are very confident that Richard Hunt used his carriage house as a station on the Underground Railroad. Richard P. Hunt owned the house that Thomas and Mary Ann McClintock and their daughters lived in. Many abolitionist speakers stayed in this house when they were in the area. The McClintocks operated a drugstore in the eastern end of the Hunt block of stores, that brick section that you're seeing, what became known in more recent years as the Street of Shops complex. The McClintocks openly advertised in local newspapers that they did not sell in their store any product made from slave labor. Here we see some of the major abolitionists of the time who stayed in the McClintock house. Both Frederick Douglass and Germaine Logan were freedom seekers themselves. Logan was a key person in the so-called Jerry rescue in Syracuse. On October 1st, 1851, a freedom seeker commonly known locally as Jerry was apprehended in Syracuse by slave catchers. Jerry was put in the jail overnight with the intention that he would then be returned to his southern plantation owner starting the next day. Jermaine Logan and the other members of the local vigilance committee in Syracuse broke into the jail that night and rescued Jerry. They got Jerry out of Syracuse to Oswego, where he would cross Lake Ontario to Canada and safety. Logan realized that he himself was now in serious jeopardy, so he decided to go to Canada for a while until things cooled off. On his way to Canada, Logan spent the first night at the McClintock house. The McClintocks were instrumental in Waterloo residents sending many anti-slavery petitions to Congress. Only one other New York State community sent more petitions to Congress than did Waterloo. Here we see the several signatures on a February 4th, 1839 anti-slavery petition. I have enlarged at the bottom the first two names so that you can see they are Mary Ann and daughter Elizabeth McClintock. Now, there are many Quakers in the area of Waterloo that are involved in anti-slavery activity, and here we see some pictures of some of those families. These Quakers or Friends were members of the Junius Monthly Meeting House, located on the 9-foot road just north of Route 96. The meeting house is gone, but the cemetery still exists, as you can see in the background of the big picture. I have enlarged a picture of one gravestone from the cemetery. Sarah was a wife of Richard P. Hunt. Before she died, she made clear that she wanted to be buried in tow cloth, not slave-grown cotton cloth. Several African American families found it safe to live and work in Waterloo. Thomas and Mariah Jackson lived on two different streets. At one time, South Seneca Street, another time, North Walnut Street. While they were living on North Walnut Street, there were also many other African American families in the neighborhood. Perhaps it was to have a neighborhood that they felt safe in. Maybe it was just coincidental. When Thomas and Mariah Jackson lived on South Seneca Street, they had many white neighbors that were abolitionists in their beliefs and activities. Also in Waterloo, the Reverend Samuel Gridley was pastor of the Presbyterian Church for many years there. He came to Waterloo as an anti-slavery activist and continued those efforts while serving in Waterloo. For example, he was a key organizer of the Seneca County Anti-Slavery Society. Richard P. Hunt and other anti-slavery businessmen deliberately in Waterloo established a woolen mill as an alternative to slave-grown cotton. In 1840, Richard P. Hunt and Thomas McClintock donated several yards of woolen cloth made at the Waterloo woolen mills. They donated it to William Lloyd Garrison. This was to enable Garrison to wear a non-slave grown suit to the World Anti-Slavery Convention being held in London. Like what was true in Seneca Falls, Waterloo had a freedom seeker barber. His name was George Webb. Going on to Geneva, this house in Geneva on Pulteney Street has a very interesting oral tradition story about an Underground Railroad incident. The oral tradition story deals with Grandmother Van Houten, who was living in the house at the time. She was a devout Methodist. As the narrative that you're going to see states, men were chasing a freedom seeker who ran up the sidewalk toward Grandmother Van Houten's front door. She let the freedom seeker in and bolted the door. She told him to go out the back door and rattle the back fence to let her know that he had successfully escaped. Then she finally opened the front door to the slave catchers. She let them then search her house. While they were searching on the second floor, she heard the back fence rattle. In this story, the house was not a planned station on the Underground Railroad. It might well have been just an isolated incident. It is also very possible that some house nearby had frequently functioned as a safe house or a station on the Underground Railroad. Here we have a Canandaigua newspaper article in which the editor attacks one of the most controversial parts of the 1850 Fugitive Slave Act, and also attacks a rival newspaper, the Geneva Gazette, for supporting that harsh law. This is still another example of how the Ontario Messenger newspaper in Canandaigua was criticizing the rival Geneva Gazette for the latter's support of that Fugitive Slave Act. In this Ontario Messenger newspaper, we have several people announcing that there will be a mass meeting to oppose the harsh Fugitive Slave Act of 1850. In other words, things were not just happening in Seneca Falls and Waterloo to be anti-slavery activity. Two of the signers were Austin Stewart and Alfred Haley, who were both themselves freedom seekers. Another one of the signers is H.W. Johnson, who was what we call a free-born African American. Although not himself a freedom seeker, this is an example of how blacks supported fellow blacks, undoubtedly, even fellow blacks who were freedom seekers. The top left newspaper article shows how in Elmira there was a vigilance committee like what I had shared earlier about Syracuse and the Jerry Rescue. The newspaper article at right tells of the plight of a male freedom seeker trying to reach up with his son in Canada. These two newspaper articles show that in many northern cities there were organized efforts to provide aid to freedom seekers, even though this was clearly illegal under provisions of the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850. Obviously, these fervent abolitionists believed that there was indeed a higher moral law that they needed to follow rather than that Fugitive Slave Act. This is a very interesting tale that shows how strong abolitionists were even willing to send local lawmen to a slave state in an effort to rescue blacks from being sold into slavery. It deals with an incident in Geneva. This slide tells details about that incident. Without going through all the details, look at the very last paragraph. It was clear that many people in Geneva were outraged about the kidnapping with the intent to sell Daniel Prue and John Haight into slavery in Kentucky in 1857. Fortunately, Prue and Haight were rescued. Prue would later serve in the Union Army during the Civil War, and he received a discharge for being severely wounded in the arm. Moving on to the Penn Yan area, we have this famous restaurant and motel today, Esperanza. It was allegedly a station on the Underground Railroad in the Penn Yan area. This house was probably an Underground Railroad station for those freedom seekers coming up Cayuga Lake, from Elmira and heading towards Geneva. Moving north, this church in Palmyra became a rather significant Underground Railroad station for those freedom seekers heading north from Geneva, Waterloo, and Seneca Falls to cross Lake Ontario at Pulteneyville or Sodus Bay. Also in Palmyra, we have the home of Pliny Sexton. Pliny Sexton was a Quaker. He clearly used his house as a station on the Underground Railroad. There was an oral tradition story that freedom seekers were frequently hidden in wagons carrying farmers' crops to Palmyra and then on to ports along Lake Ontario. Just south of Williamson is the Griffith Cooper House. Griffith Cooper was a Quaker. He used his house as a station on the Underground Railroad. There is a very fascinating oral tradition story that some freedom seekers were hidden in a haystack here when slave hunters came in pursuit of them. The story goes so far as to say that one of the slave catchers actually stuck his pitchfork at different places into the haystack, and that one of the freedom seekers' skin was pierced in the process. But he clearly realized he dare not cry out in pain because it would betray all of the freedom seekers hidden there. In Pulteneyville, we have several houses that are associated with the Underground Railroad. Captain Throop, this is his home, was a ship captain for many years, and he clearly organized boats carrying freedom seekers from Pulteneyville across Lake Ontario to freedom in Canada. The Selby House in Pulteneyville was believed also to be a final stop on the Underground Railroad before the freedom seekers got on a boat in Pulteneyville to cross Lake Ontario to Canada. The people who lived in the Hasselwander House provided much assistance to freedom seekers seeking to take a boat in Pulteneyville to cross Lake Ontario to Canada. This is a picture of what the Quaker Meeting House in Farmington looked like about 1890. The Quakers or Friends who came to services at this meeting house were actively involved in abolitionist efforts, as well as protecting the rights of Seneca Indians. And this Quaker meeting house is currently being restored. Shifting our discussion to Cayuga County, it was Quakers in Sherwood, such as Slocum Holland, who were actively involved in using Holland's Stone Store as a station on the Underground Railroad. The freedom seekers probably came from Elmira to Ithaca and then to Sherwood, and from Sherwood on to Union Springs to cross Cayuga Lake, or from Union Springs on to Auburn. In Auburn, we have the home of William Henry and Frances Seward, and the home has been clearly recognized as a rather famous station on the Underground Railroad. The kitchen, especially. It is very significant to point out that although William Henry Seward was a U.S. Senator and then Secretary of State of the United States, his wife was using the kitchen of their Auburn home as an Underground Railroad station, in complete defiance of the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850. I hope that this program has given you some insight into the many different forms that anti-slavery efforts, or Underground Railroad in its broadest meaning, took in the years leading up to the Civil War. Although it was illegal under provisions of the Fugitive Slave Act to give aid to freedom seekers, there were many strong anti-slavery people in the Finger Lakes region that were willing to defy this law and embrace a higher moral law. In this Black History Month, we should be proud of these Underground Railroad efforts. This is an important part of our Finger Lakes history. Feel free to contact me if you have need for further information.